Consumer Reports investigation found concerning levels of lead in some popular hot chocolate brands.
The new study that might have you thinking twice about reaching for that sweet treat at the grocery store.
Report out tonight is warning about metals found in some dark chocolates.
A caramel.
Heavy metals are in your chocolate, it's true. But why? And why do we care? Do chocolate producers actually think we like the taste of lead, and so they just sprinkle it in as a type of seasoning?
Come on, come on. Yeah, come on.
Whew.
Oh my God!
Well, plants absorb all of their nutrients and some of the heavy metals in the soil they're grown in. Cadmium is a naturally occurring metal that comes into our soil from weathering rocks and natural events like volcanic activity. It's easily taken up by plant roots and then distributed throughout its body. And so for the majority of us, our main cadmium exposure is through food. Being exposed to too much can lead to cancer and kidney, bone, and nerve damage. Though these issues mainly arise from tobacco and a person's occupation, and not so much through consuming food. Lead is also an environmental metal like cadmium, but is not as present in foods because plants don't efficiently absorb it as much. So most lead in food is accumulated in the growing, harvesting, and processing procedures afterwards. Exposure to lead leads to very similar health issues as cadmium, and similarly the main concern is environmental as opposed to food. When heavy metals enters a person's body, they are initially distributed into the bloodstream, sent throughout tissues and organs, and then mostly deposited into mineralizing tissue like teeth and bone. There they integrate with the bone matrix by serving as a substitute for calcium. And this is basically your body's best solution to dealing with the metals that it couldn't excrete through sweat, urine, and feces. But those heavy metals can weaken the teeth and bone that they stay in, and they stay in there for decades. And a small fraction left throughout your organs in your body can interfere with its physiological processes, leading to all of the health issues I mentioned earlier. There is virtually no known benefit whatsoever to any heavy metal exposure.
Oh, this is the worst day ever.
Hey, Homer, what gives?
Mr. Burns is making me eat all these crumbs of toxic waste.
So basically, heavy metals equals bad.
Yeah, and even a teaspoon could cause a fatal tumor.
But we all already knew that.
Our tests found concerning levels of cadmium or lead, two toxic heavy metals, in most of the dark chocolate bars we tested.
In a recent study by Consumer Reports, 28 different chocolate bars were analyzed, and every single chocolate bar had significant levels of both lead and cadmium, heavy metals.
Have you seen this Consumer Report that showed that many popular brands of chocolate are high in cadmium and lead?
Well, Consumer Labs and Consumer Reports did an independent study of several different brands of dark chocolate and found that they were high in heavy metals like cadmium, which can damage your kidneys and your bones.
It can lead to immune suppression, brain fog, fatigue, reproductive issues, kidney damage, hypertension. The list kind of goes on.
Oh, that's supposed to be chocolate. Oh, okay.
All the talk about heavy metals in the media revolves around two things: California Proposition 65 and Consumer Reports. Proposition 65 is a California-specific law that requires businesses to warn consumers if their products contain chemicals known to cause cancer, birth defects, and other reproductive harm that is above a certain threshold that they established. Prop 65 sets strict maximum allowable dose levels, or MADLs, for lead and cadmium in all foods, including chocolate. These levels are 0.5 micrograms for lead and 4.1 micrograms for cadmium. Consumer Reports is a non-profit organization that tests products and services to protect buyers by making sure they can make a fully informed decision when they buy something. And they've published 2 reports regarding chocolate. In 2022, Consumer Reports tested 28 dark chocolate bars and found that only 5 of them had amounts of lead and cadmium below California's Proposition 65 MADLs in a 1-ounce serving. Then, in 2023, they tested 48 different chocolate products, including dark and milk chocolate bars, cacao powder, chocolate chips, brownie mixes, chocolate cake, and hot chocolate. Out of these 48 products, about a third had levels of lead or cadmium above Prop 65 MADLs. And that is the reason why you keep hearing this brought up. and why I am here today, to give you the nuances that everyone just didn't really bother looking into. To begin with, Prop 65 is not the only heavy metal standard that we could be looking at, but you'll never really hear how chocolate would go against those established by the EU, WHO, FAO, USP, and FDA, because then you wouldn't be able to demonize chocolate. And even worse, because an actual scientific panel established those standards, and they weren't made by lawmakers doing their best scientific guesswork. The Codex Alimentarius Commission is a group created by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization and the WHO. Its main job is to set global food standards and guidelines to make sure food is safe and fairly traded. They encourage countries to use Codex standards as a basis for their own regulations because they are based on scientific evidence and are intended to protect consumers, while also taking into account regional differences to support fair international trade. But they are not laws. They are references for countries to refer to. They currently do have standards for some chocolate-specific products and are in the talks of establishing more. The CAC established their guidelines from exposure assessments and health risk evaluations conducted by the Joint FAO-WHO Expert Committee on Food Additives, or JECFA for short. For cadmium, JECFA's 2013 evaluation found that cadmium intake from chocolate and chocolate products was not a major health concern compared to other foods. However, for their proposed lead guideline, it was driven more by what was more practically achievable, rather than by a specific health risk study. There is no JECFA-like exposure assessment cited for lead in cacao like there is for cadmium, and so no specific Codex maximum level for lead in chocolate has been made. I provided a current proposal just for reference. The EU has stricter standards than the Codex adopted into their actual law. While being part of the CAC and referring to it, the European Food Safety Authority is responsible for evaluating the safety of food standards. I wasn't able to find any specific study or assessment as to why they decided to set their standards stricter than the CAC, but I imagine it's based on a precautionary principle where they lean more on the safer side of things. The United States Pharmacopoeia is a scientific non-profit organization that sets standards for food ingredients, supplements, and pharmaceuticals. They have nothing to do with chocolate specifically, but I included them because they did establish heavy metal intake standards that are enforced by the FDA. They use toxicological risk assessments from the WHO and the FAO, as well as epidemiological studies. Again, they don't have anything to do with chocolate specifically, but I mention them as a reference point because their heavy metal limits are backed by science and enforced by law. The Food and Drug Administration does not have any specific total intake standards for lead and cadmium. For lead, they do have an interim reference level, which is a benchmark designed to protect the most vulnerable populations against lead exposure. With 2.2 micrograms total daily intake for children and 8.8 micrograms for women of childbearing age. It's based on the CDC's blood lead reference value of 3.5 micrograms per deciliter, with an additional 10-fold safety factor. As for cadmium, they are in the process of making an official standard in their Closer to Zero initiative. In the meantime, I only have a toxicological reference value to refer to as a window of reference. With the average weight of a child being 20 kilograms, that would put their limit at 4.2 to 7.2 micrograms per day. But I have to stress this is only for reference. Nothing has been officially established by the FDA for cadmium yet. California Proposition 65 is a California-specific law requiring businesses to warn people if their products could expose them to chemicals known to cause cancer, birth defects, or other harm. The law includes over 900 substances, but the ones that we're concerned with are cadmium and lead, specifically in chocolate. Lead's MADL was based on the No Absorbable Effect Level, or the NOEL, divided by 1,000. This number, chosen by lawmakers and not scientists, is honestly the main reason as to why Prop 65 is dramatically stricter than every other regulation. For cadmium, the lowest known dose to cause harm was taken and divided by 10 to guess the NOEL, then divided by an extra 1,000. Now you need to understand that this is not the standard procedure for defining the NOEL. Ultimately, Prop 65 is a result of lawmakers and not a direct scientific panel.
With penalties for non-compliance, including fines of up to $2,500 per violation per day, and overzealous litigators looking for their cut, business owners came to the rational conclusion that the cost of a label was less than the cost of litigation. The result? Warning labels everywhere, regardless of the severity of risk or degree of exposure. In bars, restaurants, hotels, spas, ski resorts, schools, and Disneyland. On golf clubs, lamps, toasters, kids' toys, sunglasses, potato chips, pancakes, pumpkin puree, and even trees. These signs have become so common that one study found Californians have learned to simply ignore them. But we don't want to get sued either, so... Warning, this video contains information on Prop 65, known to the state of California to cause ambiguity between things that are dangerous and things that are harmless. For more information, go to holy crap, this is really not working out the way we had planned.ca.gov.
In 2018, the consumer advocacy group, As You Sow, filed a lawsuit against more than 20 chocolate companies for not complying with California Prop 65 MADLs. The lawsuit ended in updated and more clear guidelines for heavy metals in chocolate, and scientific collaboration to further reduce heavy metal content in chocolate in the future. So, they established new guidelines for chocolate in 2018 and designed them to get even stricter as time goes on. Today in 2025, new standards are in effect, and these guidelines are still stricter than any other guideline I mentioned earlier. And so with that, chocolate makers and chocolate lovers rejoiced, and the world was at peace. That was until Consumer Reports came along in 2022 and 2023 sharing lab reports on tests they had taken on chocolate. Most concerns came from them testing the amounts of heavy metals in a 1-ounce serving of dark chocolate bars, comparing it to Prop 65's heavy metal standards for lead and cadmium in food. The serving size of 1 ounce is fair, because that is around the typical serving size for most chocolate bars. The standards they used, however, were the old Proposition 65 standards for food and not the chocolate-specific ones established in 2018. They established the reports 4 years after these new standards were made. Their headquarters and testing labs are in New York, not California, but they state that they used those standards out of all the other ones because they were the safest. Well, yeah, they're the safest because they weren't established by medical or scientific professionals, but it's okay, because they very conveniently state this in one of their reports. Now, I found this report from the International Trade Commission that has Consumer Reports 2022 and 2023 heavy metal tests neatly summarized for me. It states that the dark chocolate bars Consumer Reports tested had an average of 195.4% of the lead limit and 87.6% of the cadmium limit from Proposition 65 old heavy metal standards for food. Consumer Reports didn't state the actual contents and instead gave the percentages, so I had to endure the tiresome burden of doing the math to figure it out. The heavy metal contents in a 1-ounce serving size of dark chocolate tested by Consumer Reports had an average of 0.98 micrograms of lead and 3.6 micrograms of cadmium. With this in mind, we can now compare the average bar heavy metal content to every other heavy metal standard out there, including the updated Prop 65 chocolate standards that Consumer Reports should have done to begin with. So to summarize, the average dark chocolate bar serving would comply with every standard and guideline except the outdated ones that Consumer Reports decided to use. Yes, they comply with the most strict standards that California has today. It's no wonder that actual toxicologists would agree that this is unreasonable fear-mongering. Johns Hopkins medicine toxicologist Andrew Stolbach says that going over the established MADL isn't really a concern so long as you generally have healthy nutrition. Dr. Marianne Amir-Shahi at Georgetown University School of Medicine and co-medical director of the National Capital Poison Center says that eating chocolate is relatively safe. Both of them say that chocolate is perfectly fine for women and children, and disagree with Consumer Reports' statement that they should 100% avoid it. The FDA themselves said this to Consumer Reports on the matter. And finally, a study by the Tulane Office of Research essentially came to the same conclusion that I am arguing here. They studied 155 milk and dark chocolate bars sold in the United States for its toxic metal content. And their study determined that really none of the chocolate bars that they tested were a legitimate concern. Now you could argue that no heavy metals whatsoever is good for you. And okay, that's fair. Stop eating chocolate, as well as all the other foods that have been studied to be the biggest sources of heavy metals in a person's diet, such as fruits, leafy greens, root vegetables, bread, legumes, nuts, potatoes, and cereals. This is not to scare people into eating anything. It's just to put things into perspective. If someone wanted to, they could definitely use this information to create the same type of clickbait headlines that were made from chocolate. And even more so for some specific foods like spinach, sunflower seeds, and potato chips, which have comparable, if not more, heavy metals than chocolate products. Now, of course, heavy metals equals bad, but its absorption in the body is pretty complicated. Scientists have proposed some dietary strategies to mitigate the absorption of heavy metals through people's diets. The same study by the Tulane Office of Research I talked about earlier mentions that cacao contains some nutrients that can help mitigate the absorption of heavy metals that come with it. Exercising and eating a high nutrient diet helps your body with dealing with and excreting heavy metals. Who would have thought? It makes sense that our bodies have some sort of natural defense to deal with at least a minuscule amount of heavy metals, because cadmium and lead are literally unavoidable in our environment because they are a natural part of it. To be clear, this does not justify heavy metals in chocolate or any foods for that matter. I ultimately don't think that the heavy metals in foods are anything to lose hair over, but we should continue to be vigilant just to make sure this continues to be the case. Cacao is naturally a more potent bioaccumulator than other plants, and so by comparison you can expect cacao to have more cadmium than many other plants that we eat. Still, its amounts are negligible in the grand scheme of things. For lead, however, as shown in this study, it's typically introduced in the post-harvesting and processing phases, not due to the plant's accumulation of it from the soil, meaning that there really isn't any good reason for a chocolate bar to be containing a lot of lead. But as I showed through my research, the average chocolate bar is still perfectly fine to eat and compliant to every regulatory standard made by health scientists by a generous margin. So I still don't think that eating an untested chocolate bar here and there is going to translate to health issues, and so I will continue to do so myself. But, and this is a huge but, I eat chocolate every day because I genuinely believe that it is a severely underestimated nootropic / biohack / health food, call it whatever you want. So I make sure that my daily intake are sources of chocolate that are healthiest, generally meeting the highest amount of polyphenols and the minimal amount of heavy metals. I plan to eventually make a video about this because there's so much more to it, but for now, as most people probably are already aware, if you want the health benefits of chocolate, make sure you get a minimally processed bar with high cacao content with as minimal unneeded additives as possible.